Welcome to the podcast PUNKT.UA with Tinka
and Anna. This podcast is dedicated to Ukrainian studies.
We conduct interviews with scholars researching Ukraine.
Join us on the PUNKT.UA, the podcast of the UNDIPUS project,
which stands for Pluralizing Ukrainian Studies, Understanding the War in Ukraine.
Could you please introduce yourself? Tell us your name, your affiliation, your status.
Hi, I'm Valeria Korablyova. I'm based in Charles University in Prague in the Institute of International Studies, Faculty of Social Sciences, and I'm teaching there as assistant professor at the Department of Russian and East European Studies, and also I'm the head of the Research Center, Ukraine in a Changing Europe.
Hi, I'm Oleksandr Chertenko. I'm research fellow and lecturer at the Justus Liebig University in Giessen at the Institute for Slavic Studies. And I'm also having my project within the larger joint project UNDIPUS.
Both of you are organizers of this conference on post-socialist wars. How did you come up with the idea of the conference?
It happened this way. We have known each other for a while and we have thought to do something interesting and non-trivial together. And every week, people engaged in Ukrainian studies usually try to do some special events on the anniversary of the full-scale invasion. And last year, there was the 10th anniversary of the Russian-Ukrainian War and the second anniversary of the invasion. And we thought that would be like a good occasion to finally materialize our long discussed project to do something together. However, we didn't want to get lost in this avalanche of all sorts of expertise, events, and comments around the war. So we wanted to open up the debates and to include like more broad voices and also to try to paint a bigger picture. And so we started discussing, engaging in these very productive debates and many meetings on Zooms and otherwise, trying to find a more innovative framework or concept, if you wish.
Yeah, and I was of course playing quite a long time with this idea of making something on the war in Ukraine, which was quite an old idea because it was already there as we still didn't have a full-scale invasion. And then then came the full-scale invasion, and I was thinking about how do you develop a topic like that, right? You had it in quite another form. How do you approach that? And then we came to this idea that basically we were thinking about that back in 2023, I think. And we thought, what are you going to do if you have 1,000 of different conferences working with the same keywords, right? Only Ukraine, only after 2022, as if there haven't been any Ukraine and war before February 2022. And we somehow both came to the conclusion we have to make it a broader topic. We have to approach it from a broader perspective, and not only a larger picture, but what is very important for me, also a more complex picture. Not only having like something bigger than life, but also having something which is as complex as life is. And then it materialized somehow. And what I very much share. In our collaboration, as we are not thinking into one direction, but it's not extremely different, I would say, but it's different what we think of different points around the war before and after 2022. What I very much appreciate is that we can somehow still be in dialogue around that. It's not an easy thing at the moment. It haven't been an easy thing ever, but it became a very, very complicated after 2022. And I very much share that I very much cherish that we have this ability and this kind of playground to play with ideas, to discuss things which we see differently.
Right, indeed. I would say that we are not looking in the same direction and we are coming from very different points, but we meet somewhere in the middle. And what we do share is that shared passion for complexity. Rather than oversimplifying things, like trying to be more inclusive and incorporate more voices and perspectives in a meaningful way. And that's exactly what we try to do here.
How would you say this multi-directional perspective on the war helped to understand it better, or what is an advantage of this approach?
It's not necessarily about understanding it better, because there is a certain monodirectional teleology in this assumption, but rather about rethinking and trying to challenge our well-established sort of common sense knowledge, quote unquote, and rather to try to zoom out and to see the forest behind the trees and to see other people looking at the forest from different directions, if I can use this metaphor.
Well, I was thinking about the situation we had after 2022, like looking on what was going on in Ukraine since February 2022, and then speaking only about Ukraine as if there have never been any post-socialist wars. Well, probably it's also a kind of unique war. We haven't had something like that on the post-Soviet space in terms of scale. We probably also haven't had something like that in terms of a direct imperial attack, right? Without any turning or something, right? But it's not a new phenomenon. And I was wondering, how did we manage to approach the situation when we are speaking about the war in Ukraine as a phenomenon that has never been before in any form? And I was wondering if we could build up some idea of how it could look like, what the optics for this gaze on the Ukrainian war might be look like. Would we probably take up something and develop something which concerned the previous wars, say in Chechnya or in Abkhazia or lately in Nagorno-Karabakh. I mean, the conflicts are still going on. Right, we have the victims, they have the perpetrators. It's very much complicated. But I was wondering if we could obtain a new optics if we look at it from a different perspective. We get a probably more stereoscopic view, and then we see, okay, there are some things which are unique to this war, and there are some things which also which have also repeated before. There are some things which have been previously there. There are some memories which were emerging since the Second World War and also after the First World War, and then incorporated in this conflict, making it even more complex. So, I mean, this complexity idea was, of course, a guiding light for us somehow.
And I want to remind us all that actually there is no established notion of post-socialist wars, and we were thinking what would be the shorthand for something that we want to describe and focus on in these events. And there is not like too big but quite sound body of literature on comparison of these secessionist wars in the post-Soviet region, comparing the secessionist tendencies in Transnistria, Abkhazia, and Donbass. And after 2014, that was relevant for comparison. But 2022 was something different. And therefore, it became more challenging, but also more stimulating to think seriously how to frame it. And if Putin wages the war trying to revise the outcome of the Cold War, and then we have like Russian active engagement in military conflicts in other places, and we see that the overthrow of the regime and Assad flows to Moscow, and we have North Korean fighters in Ukraine. So this increasing internationalization and these like big claims, is it just a smokescreen for some like very direct and blunt purposes? Or we can take it as a serious intellectual challenge and try to think what these post-socialist wars are about.
Okay, so what would your conclusions be? Did we find any answers to these questions that you just posed?
I don't think so. I think we have found even more questions, but that's a normal thing for such conferences. You do not find answers. But how should we imagine an answer? I mean, or the answer to this kind of questions? No, we had a very much patchwork-like conference, to be sure, right? We were not expecting it to be otherwise as well. But there were a lot of perspectives which make me think further, right? I'm not sure how you would see it, but for me, it's a kind of stimulants for a further thinking on the perspective we tried to develop, right? So there is no answer. There are further questions. There are further complexities I see at the moment. We were discussing for example, the keynote lecture, right, made by Professor Mark Basinger, this was also kind of starting point of thinking about even more complexity, right? Because it was complex in itself. But I'm thinking about other perspectives which might be additional to that and additional to that. So it's a very interesting topic, which is somehow has these dynamics of self-developing.
Yeah, there is this secret joy of researchers to pose the right questions. And if we share this like specific take on complexity, then complexity is about like even adding even more questions. So basically gathering together is, in the first place, it's about validation, that you are not lonely in your assumptions and hypotheses, and some of them seem crazy at the first glance, but then you meet like-minded people. Then you have some interim clarity on certain issues, and then the new field of complexity opens up. But now you know the direction and the potential team of like-minded people whom you have engaged in a meaningful dialogue with. And I think it's a good enough, to put it mildly, outcome of the conference.
That's the point where we diverge, of course, because I very much like not only like-minded persons, but also other-minded persons. And I think I was approached on that point precisely by 5 or 6 colleagues, which impressed me, I must say. I'm very much confused about that. That this topic or this point might have become something unusual in the academic space. But I was told, well, thank you for creating a space where different diverging points of view might meet and do not eat up each other, but just enter into a kind of rational discussion. I haven't thought that this is a forgotten experience, but it seems to be the one if I'm approached by different colleagues from different angles saying the same thing. And I very much like that moment of, wow, we can do it. I mean, we can stay in one place, do not cut a throat to each other thinking differently, and still try to arrive to probably not a common point of view, but something of a development of both points of view meeting each other and not being identical.
And this is the like-mindedness I had in mind. Not being monologous, not like having the same answers to the same question, and not necessarily sharing even the particular interest, but being interested in complexity and in some academic rigor and in certain basic rules of academic communication as well.
Can you share some highlights? What impressed you most?
Well, one of them certainly was the keynote. Oleksandr has already mentioned that Professor Basinger was an excellent choice that was a very good fit for the conference, and it was like very fundamental, but also transparent, and people coming from different academic backgrounds, they were able to grasp not only the gist of it, but the entire argument as it was unfolding. I also had several people approaching me with these comments, so it's not only my particular opinion. But then also, we all have these talks about interdisciplinarity. It has been trendy for a while, but it does not necessarily work every time, and I think it worked out perfectly well. So bringing people from different disciplines, some deploying the humanities methodology, some coming from critical theory approach, some people engaged in like hardcore political science or IR. So having a very different methodological toolkit and vocabulary and approaches. And somehow they were capable to engage in a meaningful discussion, and how this interdisciplinarity worked and how much of this stereoscopic picture or multifaceted perspectives on the wars emerged. That was impressive for me. That was the highlight.
Well, I think we have, of course, very different views on the conference because we have basically visited 2 different conferences, right? We had 2 parallel panels. And we have been dividing panels among us. So that means that is, of course, we have visited different panels and have heard different talks. But I would not be concerned about that. I think I don't think it might be the right answer to your question to say, well, I like that I like the presenter X, right? It's not the point. I think the point is I very much liked, also as Valeria has said, I very much liked the discussion itself. It was almost always interesting, well, it's a self-compliment somehow, right? Because we are the organizers of the conference, and we're saying, well, we like our own conference, why not, right? But I'm wondering still if there is some imagination of objectivity, and for me personally, it was very much enlightening in the most cases. Of course, not 100%; it's never 100%, but it was a very interesting. At many points, and that was the thing I like very much. And also, that's the point where I totally agree. This interdisciplinary thing, which worked out. We had also in my parallel of sessions, we had a lot of people coming to listen to the talks made by, say, literary scholars and not originating from literary scholarship, or coming to listen to political scientists not being a political scientist, right? And not only listening to that, and somehow sitting back and relaxing, but also being very much involved in the discussion, which made sense. So I very much like that point. I mean, not normally, but often you have interdisciplinary experiences on the conferences where you have political sciences speaking with political sciences and literary scholars speaking with cultural scholars, and that's only because they are in parallel. They are you name it an interdisciplinary discussion. But what I have experienced during the last 2 days was really a kind of dialogue, also not only between people having different points of views, but also between people originating from different paradigms. Basing on different presumptions, but still being able to speak to each other meaningfully.
And last but not least, this diversity and inclusiveness was not only due to this academic diversity, but also about this regional distribution, because for me it's very important that we do not have the bubbleization, if you wish, of Ukrainian studies, that it becomes like a thing in itself, the globe of Ukraine style, when people dealing with Ukraine are talking to people who are dealing with Ukraine professionally. And that is why we were opening up, and even if we received the majority of applications focusing like exclusively on Ukraine, we were trying to incorporate people working on other regions on some adjacent topic. And so we had also some interesting presentations covering Visegrad 4, India, Israel, other contexts. So that was interesting, like to open up more and to put the Ukrainian developments in dialogue with what has been happening in other contexts and places.
And that is, of course, that was always an adventure to find out how the war in Ukraine, how differently the war in Ukraine was perceived in different countries, in different regions, and in different media, if I may put it this way. So I'm thinking about Israeli perceptions. I think about the Indian perceptions, where I was not at all sure if the Indians know where it is, but it turned out, well, okay, they are thinking about it much more than I have ever imagined. And well, that was an interesting point. I have never thought about it, but somehow I think we probably a little bit underestimate how the war in Ukraine is basically finds this echo very far away from where we as people with Ukrainian passports are sitting at the moment, right? Not only from Germany, not only from Ukraine, not only the globus of Ukraine, but also a kind of very different regions which are very much affected by this war. I never had an impression they are that affected, but that seems to be the case. So it was one of the most interesting adventures for me during the conference.
Great. My last question would be, what's next? Do you have any plans? Is something coming out of the conference?
One of the highlights is informal communication, which complements the formal one. And building those networks, it is like building the infrastructure for future collaboration. And the immediate result, which is not necessarily short-term to be realized, but still planned in the foreseeable future, is to publish something that a broader audience can read. some traces, some materialization of those discussions that have been happening here during those couple of days.
Well, that would be a pity if we wouldn't manage to do it, right? Because we all know hundreds of conferences. We all are always on the road from one conference to the next. You never see an edited volume, right? You hear some 10 presentations, 20 presentations, which you very much like, and then you probably get 5 of them published in some peer-reviewed journals, which appear 17 years after the conference itself. So it's kind of well, it's not an optimal solution as I see it, and I would rather somehow try to reforge these inspirations which we had during these 2 days into something more durable.
Thank you very much for organizing this insightful and fruitful and productive conference. Thank you for bringing all of us together. And thank you for being here with us in this podcast. And goodbye.
Yeah, may you introduce yourself? What is your name? What is your academic title, status, and the institution you belong to?
I'm Monika Wingender. I'm a linguist specialized in Slavic languages, and I'm the managing director of the Giessen Center for Eastern European Studies. This is an interdisciplinary center that combines Slavic linguistic literature, Slavic history with politology and social sciences. So I'm very much used to research in an interdisciplinary field of research.
What was your presentation topic on this conference? What was your main thesis and maybe the main conclusion or conclusions?
The title of my talk is Languages and War. So I'm researching on the complex interrelationship of languages and war, violence, and in which cases languages become a trigger for violence, for example, and in other cases how war influences language situation, what is the impact of violence and war on language situations, and my case studies came from Ukraine. And my main thesis is that the full-scale invasion of Russia provoked ruptures in the language situation in Ukraine. We had a long history of language policy in Ukraine before, but this full-scale invasion since 2022 provoked ruptures. So, for example, I give you some examples. The most important ruptures concern the language prestige, of course, that now, because of the war, the Ukrainian language became the prestige of the language of resistance, and on the other side, Russian became more and more the role of a language of the enemy and aggressor. And prestige is one thing in a language situation. Another one is, of course, language use and language practices. And here we can observe since 2-3 years now that in large-scale surveys and polls, the language use in Ukraine is also changing in some way. And another example will be, of course, the role of language laws. So we had, for example, in 2019, the new state language law. In the first time, it changed not very much in the language situation, but now, after following the full-scale invasion, we can observe, of course, that now the goals of this language law very much develop in the Ukrainian language situation. It's that not only the prestige, but also the use of Ukrainian is increasing now in Ukraine.
Maybe you already answered the question, how does your investigation help understanding the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, my perspective from the linguistic research helps a lot in understanding what means decommunization, what means de-Russification, and what means decolonization, because we, from a linguistic point of view, have a little bit another approach to those processes. Take the example of derussification. For me, derussification means also purism in the Ukrainian standard language. What does it mean, derussification? For example, in lexical, on the level of the lexicon, grammar, and so on. On the other hand, what means decolonization from a linguistic point of view? It's a very difficult term to speak about decolonization because it's very broad. It means, in principle, the historical periods of Ukraine. So it does not help very much to explain now the developments in the language situations of Ukraine. And decommunization is also a very difficult term because it means different periods. We had another decommunization after the breakup of the Soviet Union than now what is going on in Ukraine. And decommunization is now very narrow in the sense of derussification. So I can contribute from perspective of linguistics a lot of new approaches or insights on those terms and concepts.
Mm-hmm. What was your highlight until now on this conference? What did you like most and why, maybe?
To be honest, I have no highlight because everything is great, everything is fantastic and very interesting, and I learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Would you please introduce yourself? What is your name, academic title or status, if you'd like to share, and institution you belong to?
Yes, hello, my name is Anna Ivanova. I'm a doctoral candidate here in Giessen at the Graduate Center for the Study of Culture. I write my dissertation in sociology, and I'm focusing on topics of memory politics, urban space transformations, and specifically Ukrainian society.
What was your presentation topic about on this conference? What were your main theses and what may be your conclusions already?
I wanted to focus on how the wartime politics of memory in Ukraine interact with the way how space is produced. I looked at the example of the eastern Ukrainian city of Kharkov and tried to depict the contradictions that appear in the process of implementation of the current state memory politics. Basically, the main argument that I wanted to make is that there are certain discrepancies between the way how the state memory politics portray the Ukrainian society and the empirical reality, which is multi-layered, also contradictory, not homogeneous. And I wanted to show different actors which are involved in the process of space transformation. Basically, I'm talking about the state campaign, which got the name of decolonization and is largely promoted by state institutions, by media, by journalists, also influencers. But then also I wanted to present the reaction of the ordinary inhabitants of Kharkov and try to point to the fact that not all of them perceive the city, its toponyms, its monuments, memorials, graffitis, as something that is necessarily to be removed, replaced, or destroyed. I was talking about the results of my interviews very briefly, but still I wanted to make a point that by implementing certain form of memory politics into the city, the state not only transformed public spaces, but also intrude into the private life, since the city is often viewed as home and associated with home and belonging. So when certain major changes happen to it, people are not necessarily satisfied. So yes, I wanted to show this complexity of reactions which are possible. And I demonstrated the results of my interviews, also the results of ethnography that I did in the city, and also a bit of my social media analysis.
How does your investigation might help to understand the war in Ukraine, if it can?
I think I really like the way how the project which organized this conference is named, especially this idea of pluralizing Ukrainian studies. And I think there is also a need to pluralize Ukrainian society or treat it as a plural, diverse, complex, complicated. And definitely not homogeneous. I guess my project does not target the reasons why the war started. It does not suggest some solutions, or it's not directed at any direct actions which can bring to the end of the war or which could point to the reasons why it started. What I try to show with my project is that there are many ways how people could suffer from the war. On the one hand, I talk about very direct consequences of the war, such as material destruction. I talk about how the cities are being destroyed, how the infrastructure, historical sites, residential buildings get destroyed, and this is kind of one direction of loss which people experience in the frontline cities. But then I also talk about the symbolic loss which people experience when they find themselves in situation of rapid, radical change, which happens as a result of the implementation of certain form of politics of memory. So yes, I think my research tries to point at this, that there are several directions where loss comes from, and maybe it does not help to understand the war that much, but it helps to understand that there are certain forms of vulnerabilities which are present in the war, and some of them are not taken into account. And maybe if we pay attention to different kinds of losses, it would help to at least to treat some marginalized groups, some disadvantaged groups, or also regular victims of the war, to treat them as people who lost something and who also need an additional support, but not an additional layer of loss, which can be symbolic, but still bring this feeling of the home which disappears both physically and also symbolically.
What is or what was your highlight on this conference? What did you like maybe the most, and what about it?
I really liked the diversity of the opinions which are present there, and still the ability to communicate with each other and to lead a dialogue, which is something rare in our times, in this very polarized world, and also the polarized situation of the war. So that was something that I enjoyed. But to bring it to a more positive note, I also liked that some people brought the original food, some Indian cookies, some Austrian chocolate. So it was very nice. I think sharing food is a good gesture. So I don't think that many participants mentioned something like that, but that gives me a chance to mention it myself. So the food which participants brought from their countries were very nice gesture and also very delicious dish.
Maybe you like to introduce yourself. What is your name, your academic title, if you like, and the institution you belong to?
My name is Matthias Schwarz, and I'm working in Berlin at the Leibniz Center for Literary and Cultural Research, where I'm heading the program area in world literature, and my professional specialization is on Russian and Polish literatures and cultures.
Here on this conference, what was your presentation about? What was the topic? And maybe you would like to tell us the main thesis you had or the main conclusions you had.
I have at the moment a collaborative research project on popular culture in Eastern Europe, more specifically on popular culture in authoritarian or right-wing states like Hungary and Poland, but also Belarus and Russia. And we are interested how popular culture is correlated to social and political developments and are mirrored there, or maybe also contrasted and subverted in popular culture. And we work there on different formats of popular culture that could be TV series, stand-up comedies, or rock music. And I'm working specifically on TV series and popular literature, and I presented here how the Ukraine, nowadays Poland, is represented in some selected TV series and also popular history novels. And the main thesis is we have in Poland this for sure official and widely supported mood and support for Ukraine in the war against the Russian aggressor. But if you look at popular culture, there are much more ambivalences, gray fields, and also contradictions concerning this picture of Ukraine nowadays. And that is also influenced by many historical motives and historical development, because Poland has once long ago a nobles republic until the 18th century, until Poland was divided, and where the big eastern parts of this Polish Republic were situated in nowadays Ukraine, and all these romantic mythologies and topics are still actualized nowadays in popular culture, in historical novels, in popular costume dramas, in TV series, or also in contemporary criminal and action films, and that was my topic.
Maybe you have 1-2 examples about it?
Yes, there's, for instance, a very interesting phenomenon. It was an Ukrainian TV series produced after 2014, and it was situated in the 18th century when Poland was divided in the nowadays Ukrainian Chernihiv region under Russian Tsarist rule, and it's such an historical drama. And this TV series called Love and Change was extremely successful in Polish television, the first TV program. There were 3 seasons altogether, and I looked at this TV series at the background of nowadays war, and is interesting. It's situated in the late 19th century after the Crimean War, so you have also a post-war situation, but under completely different historical and political circumstances, and how this is imaginary linked to nowadays present.
How does your investigation might help understanding the war in Ukraine?
I would say it doesn't help to understand the war itself, not at all. But what it helps to understand is how popular or widespread moods, anxieties and fears, but also hopes and disappointments connected to the war in the actual society, here the Polish society, are articulated and maybe reframed in popular media formats. So it's more about the perception. We have the political perception, we have the political discourse, but very often the political discourse doesn't represent widespread also resentments, widespread uncertainties, and popular culture is the field in every society where you could fix or more precisely name these ambivalences and these contradictions within the society. And sometimes they become then very influential after some elections. And it's like popular culture is quite symptomatic for also changing moods in society. And it's more about how the attitude to the war in Ukraine and to the Russian aggressor changes in European societies.
Do you had a highlight here on this conference? What you liked maybe the most and why?
I couldn't say that there's one highlight. What I liked most is that at this conference they not only fixed exclusively on the Russian-Ukrainian war and its history, but also had this comparative approach, asking how other wars in the 21st century in other world regions like the Yugoslav war also affected and changed fundamentally our understanding of the present, of war, and the perception of others, of aggressors, and so on, so that it reframed our and historicized in a way our perception of the war. And I think that is quite important because very often we forget about it and saying that now this is exclusively the side, it's only this one. And if we have a more broader comparative approach, we could see also more the differentiations and the maybe also the blind spots in contemporary discussions.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you and hello. And maybe please introduce yourself. You can tell your name, maybe your title or academic status and the institution you belong to.
Yes, I'm Marco Puleri. I'm an associate professor at the University of Bologna, Department of Political and Social Sciences.
My name is Alessandro Achilli. I'm an associate professor of Slavic languages and literatures at the University of Cagliari, Italy.
What was your presentation topic at this conference? What were your main theses, for example, and maybe your main conclusions? Would you share it with us?
The title of our presentation was The Role of Intellectuals. We could say the role of intellectuals in the social dynamics and political dynamics in Ukraine. It was about political imagination, we could say. So it was an attempt at analyzing the different positions that emerged within the intellectual context in Ukraine in order to potentially imagine a future Ukraine in post-war times.
We also focused on the issue of responsibility, of how this is conceptualized by Ukrainian writers and cultural actors, of course in the context, in the framework of the ongoing Russian aggression, but also looking back at what happened before 2022, and in the future written version of the paper also going even further back. And the reason why we decided to work together on this presentation is that together we are combining a literary, cultural studies point of view with a political science one.
And which conclusions did you present?
The conclusion was not so positive in a sense, since I believe that also this platform that actually we have here in Giessen to discuss about the impact of the war on Ukraine, but also the impact of the war dynamics in other post-socialist contexts, is quite useful to us to try to highlight what are the potential contradictions in the internal dynamics emerging in Ukraine as for the shaping of new memory, cultural policies impacting also on the way Ukrainianness is going to be imagined in the future, and how different social groups will actually try to readapt themselves to such narratives promoted from the top. So we, in a sense, try to highlight how the new dynamics shaped by authorities in Ukraine going towards the direction of deprivation, in a sense, of some features of Ukrainian society, such as the policies of decommunization and decolonization are leading to, nowadays should be seen maybe with a more critical eye and outlook in order to understand actually how they could be reshaped maybe in the future in order to let other sections of Ukrainian society feel included in this new project of Ukrainianness to be developed from the top.
On the other hand, I think that the focus on literature in our paper, in our presentation, is also important because it shows to which extent literature and culture are able to respond to what is happening in Ukraine. Of course, this is the case of what has been happening, what has been going on since 2022, but even before. I mean, the strong interaction between history, the present, and culture in Ukraine has always been particularly strong. And I think that this is interesting for foreign audiences, foreign observers, because it shows how important literature is for a fuller understanding of the situation in Ukraine. It's a key to understand Ukraine. Also because all the problems, all the contradictions, all the issues at stake in Ukrainian society are somehow reflected in literature. Literature is thriving. On the other hand, of course, the way literature is understood and conceptualized in Ukraine today has problems, contradictions. There is a sort of ideological pressure on literature. This is something that we have observed, but on the other hand, it also enjoys rather strong support from the state. And this allows it to thrive way more than was the case before 2014. So here we see this contradiction at play. On the one hand, literature is thriving. On the other hand, of course, it carries the burden of responsibility. And that was, as you remember exactly, our starting point.
You already answered a bit the next question, how your investigation helps to understand the war in Ukraine, but maybe you can also add something what you think is important, or maybe also your perspective as a scholars from Italy and not scholars originally from Ukraine, maybe.
I believe that actually such conferences as the one we are having here in Giessen, and also in terms of what we learned by sharing different perspectives, can be of great help to each of us in his or own, we could say, academic and national context, in a sense. I had several discussions with colleagues from Ukraine who are now working in the West, for example, and my perception also of the role we could play in imagining, also in a sense, or in getting into a dialogue among ourselves as being long-term observers of Ukrainian dynamics, and also looking at what has been the impact of the war in Ukraine, creating new networks of experts, scholars, who are also in touch with intellectuals within the countries and social movements within the country, could be also to contribute to such a process by taking into account very different dynamics. Today, we attended a very interesting panel devoted to we could say the LGBTQI movement in Ukraine and the dynamics, the contradictions that are emerging out of the war. I guess that the participation also of these marginal groups within the broader Ukrainian community should be taken into account also in order to build, we could say, a Ukraine of the future that can be a kind of community that can move forward rather than going back to a reductionist approach to Ukrainian identity. And that's something that has been thoroughly discussed in the past about language communities, about, we could say, full-fledged recognized national minorities within the country. But maybe as for social groups within Ukraine, I guess the contribution of scholars working on this field maybe can be of help for imagining a different Ukraine, even as being made by very different social movements. I don't know, Alessandro, what do you think?
Well, going back to the issue of the way in which our investigation may help understand the war in Ukraine, I would say that it's a multidisciplinary approach, maybe of help. Again, I think that the way we read the interaction between society, politics, and culture in today's Ukraine may be useful for a deeper understanding of contemporary Ukrainian culture. So as we know, foreign audiences, literary markets nowadays are way more receptive to Ukrainian culture than was the case before the full-scale invasion. On the other hand, of course, Ukrainian culture needs to be put in a context to be better, fully understood by its recipients. On the other hand, as I already mentioned, I guess that culture may help better understand what is going on, also the cultural premises of what we are observing. So I think that this combination of humanities and with a political approach may be very fruitful.
What was your highlight on this conference, and what you liked most, and maybe why?
I guess that what I like the most of this conference has been the atmosphere that it has created in terms of having an open, critical discussion about what is happening nowadays in Ukraine. Of course, I would say all of those who attended this conference are supportive for the Ukrainian cause, of course, are connected to it by, as for, I would say, what are their life experience or academic research and network in terms of connections to the country, and in terms also of understanding what were the dynamics that preceded the war and who was the victim of the aggression. At the same time, to be critical in times of war is also a quite difficult issue to deal with when being also not only an academic but also a human being, and knowing what are the sufferings that follow these dynamics, and also knowing that you are not experiencing the war yourself. So sharing with other scholars and people joining together in Giessen to discuss such dynamics in a safe environment also, that where everyone knows that we share the same convictions, but at the same time everyone would like to bring something more to the table. That's, I would say, the added value of this conference as for what is my point of view.
Yeah, I can only second Marco. I mean, we have heard a lot. We've spoken a lot about attempts at safe spaces during this conference. And in a way, this conference is a sort of safe space because, yes, we're all supportive of Ukraine, but here I guess that everyone is free to share with others their problems, their doubts, their ethical dilemmas. As many participants have mentioned during these days, when we deal with Ukraine, especially with contemporary Ukraine, there are a lot of ethical problems at stake when we deal with materials, be it interviews, be it history, be it literature again. And my impression was that in the framework of this conference, really everyone felt confident about the possibility, the opportunity of sharing their own doubts, their own problems, their own questions, their own mistakes also to a certain extent. When it comes to what I really liked, apart from interaction with colleagues, I have to say I learned a lot from the keynote of day one by Mark Basinger. Not being a political science scholar, I really enjoyed his presentation because it was really clear, really structured, and it's not always the case when people who don't work in political science listen to keynotes or presentations. I really enjoyed him, and it helped me clarify a lot of questions that I had in my mind.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the interview.
This was the podcast PUNKT.UA,
which is part of the UNDIPUS project at the University of Greifswald,
supported by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research.
Join us on the PUNKT.UA podcast.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.